It's my pleasure to welcome back to the program David Hawkins. David, how are you?
I'm very well, Jason. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's lovely to see you as always, David. And of course, this is our free preview to the regular show that you and I have been doing, Reverse Engineered Crime Scene Investigations with David Hawkins. And of course, that is a show that is available only on Patreon. But in an effort to share this information with as many people as possible, you and I have taken to doing these free previews, which are not just an advertisement to drive people to patreon.com, although it is very important that people sponsor the show, and I would like to encourage people to do that. We also want to share a good amount of that information with people, and it's important, David, for me, that people sponsor you on patreon.com. They can do that by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and I'm showing the page right now. I'm glad to see support is growing for David, and if people are watching this preview broadcast on YouTube or Periscope or Facebook or on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, I would encourage people to go over to David's Patreon site at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and sponsor David. The work that he's doing is invaluable and takes quite a bit of time, and there's really nowhere else that you can get this. David, you know, I'm not sure if I've discussed this with you in depth, but my motivation for creating this only on Patreon series was not just to create a financially sustainable situation for myself and you and the other guests that come to the show, because everyone like you who comes on the show is working very hard to share this unpopular information that can't easily be monetized on YouTube. You and I aren't being called by Sean Hannity to appear on Fox, so it's almost impossible for us to carry on this work in a sustainable way without the support of the community at large, people who want this information, to continue. So it really is very important that people who care about what we're talking about sponsor the program, sponsor you, David, and allow us to continue with this work. But beyond that, we've realized that there is this sort of trollified environment on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, and they've moved in a way both as corporate entities and as individuals who possibly through the social media protection apparatus that you've told us about from Kinetic, they've taken steps to prevent us from sharing this type of information on YouTube. So it's just a necessary thing for us to have an alternative outlet for it. And patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth is a fantastic alternative to that environment. And with that, David, I'd invite you to take us down the road of what you've prepared for us today and what people can see at 4 o'clock on patreon.com, because it's truly staggering.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And it's, I think I'm getting a bit of an echo. I don't know. Okay, that's gone better. This point about funding, it's very interesting. And I don't say people meaningly, but I've often been told, especially recently, David, the truth is free. So when you go after money, it somehow compromises your search for the truth or the communications for the truth. Well, I always try and think of an appropriate and pithy response. Maybe the truth should be free, but lies are very expensive. And the people who lie well and successfully spend a great deal of money on communicating a lie and protecting it. And as you point out, the language of this patent office or individual patents like social engineering protection appliance, the government or the people who want to manipulate the public's perception of the truth spend a great deal of money on these companies that sort of pop out of the woodwork, like Kinetic. Kinetic was built with Serco out of the breakup of the monolith at the Porton Down Bioweapons Research Center. And now you have Kinetic crawling all over North American public perceptions of some of these great crimes with this social engineering protection appliance. And what that is, it's about looking at the flow of information or communications by email and using semantic and non-semantic, non-semantic meaning images and things, to filter out what might be embarrassing to the institutional liars, which is the media, or the mainstream media generally, and certain elements of the government in particular. So to combat that, you've gone to great expense and I've gone to great expense, particularly in terms of sweat equity. I've spent thousands of hours trying to break into this social protection world with a truth engine. Actually, in artificial intelligence, when I was working in Schlumberger in Ridgefield in Connecticut, they often used to talk about inference engines. And what I've been trying to do is build an inference engine for the truth. And what you and I are doing, I think, is to try and build an audio-graphical communication system that allows the public to participate and deploy this inference engine for the truth against a backdrop of facts. And for me, and I think you and I are both sharing this vision or perception, the facts are nested in the Patent Office, the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And you've done this wonderful schematic, which is derived from the storyboard that I did, I guess, about 6 weeks ago. And I don't know if you could just flick onto the storyboard. It's a 12 by 18 inch poster. And what I'm encouraging people to do in the context of interviews such as the ones you and I have been doing, is to always have a paper copy, or at least a storyboard, over their computer so they can look at it, because the language is really obscure. And that's one of the methods by which people within the conspiracy screen out the public, because it's such an obscure language, like social engineering protection appliance, or these, what do I call it, sabotage spore powders, and so on. It's a language that's almost totally foreign to everyday folks. Now, thank you. If you just leave that sabotage spore powder image in place, it's a nice looking image, but the message behind it is truly sinister, cryptic, and indicative of what is to come if Americans don't wake up to the fact that for the past 30, 40, 50 years, they've been under attack, what I call, or what is called, a man-in-the-middle attack, through the Imperial Bridge. And incarnations of the Imperial Bridge go back to the 1840s or 50s, when the main telegraph cable office of the General Post Office in London was called the Imperial Brain. Now, if you look at sabotage spore powder, what that shows schematically is a way of making very fine-grained silica, which can be mixed, for example, if you're so minded, with the rather heavy clumping anthrax bacillus, so that it can be sent through the mail to, let's say, a couple of weeks after the 9/11 attack, to Senators Dashley and Leahy, so that when the people opened that letter, they got what is known as inhalation as opposed to cutaneous anthrax. And inhalation anthrax means you've breathed in the anthrax bacillus, which is coated with this sort of electrostatic silica powder that moves the little anthrax bacilli apart. So they go down into the pores, the finest pores, I think they're called the trachea of the lungs. Very difficult to get out, very difficult to treat. You end up dying horribly of inhalation anthrax. The message there is, and I tried to convey that to Field McConnell some time ago, that when a letter containing silica powder was sent to the Marine Corps headquarters a few months ago, and when it was opened, about 11 people in the vicinity of that letter got nosebleeds, they were sending a message. And I'm not sure, Field has a lot more faith in the intelligence and capability of the Marine Corps generals around President Trump. I don't need to have faith or any commitment or respect for those people. I think they're probably in the right environment extremely capable, which tends to be, a frontline environment when you've got people coming at you in waves with various kinds of weapons and, Semper Fi and all the rest of it, and you look after your colleagues. What they're not used to is thinking outside the box or recognizing a man-in-the-middle attack when it happens. And that schematic and our show, the free show, what I'm trying to convey and sharing with you, Field, is how to convey to the public at large, at no cost to them, what a man-in-the-middle attack over the Imperial AI bridge would look like, and how easily or how vulnerable people like Field McConnell, who's a Top Gun fighter pilot, very capable, very quick-witted, very knowledgeable in his domain, or his sister, Kristine Marcy, how vulnerable they are to a man-in-the-middle attack with the resources available to the people who set up the Imperial Bridge, which I believe include NM Rothschild, the fifth oldest bank in the United Kingdom. It was set up in London, I think, in 1811. And Rothschild's clients, which include your president, Donald Trump, and Queen Elizabeth II, both of whom, I believe, are vulnerable, either directly or through their families, to blackmail and extortion, and into doing things they really don't want to do, in a manner that I think you and I, Crowdsource the Truth and reverse CSI storyboards, we can open the lid on this so the public can peer in at no cost to themselves and start understanding what a man-in-the-middle attack looks like on two particular individuals, the siblings, Field McConnell and his sister Kristine Marcy. Over to you, Justin.
Well, what I'd like to clarify with you, David, of course, is first this Imperial Bridge, the Federal Bridge, they are one and the same. It's sort of your nomenclature to call it the Imperial Bridge. And I also want to clarify exactly what the man-in-the-middle attack is, because something I've observed with genius-level types, such as yourself, is that there's frequently a body of information that's so well known to you that you just rush over it, and many people in the audience might be left quite confused. So the first thing I want to discuss is this Federal Bridge diagram. And it took me, I don't want people viewing to feel embarrassed or gun shy in any way if they are intimidated by this information or the language, because it is quite confusing. And this diagram that we're looking at, and I apologize, David, it's on a screen that's not shared with you, but the audience can see it right now. This is the diagram that's the 2013 version of the Federal Bridge diagram. And basically what this is showing us is an infographic that illustrates essentially a password network, a communications network that utilizes the public internet but keeps the communications secure through a series of keys, which are essentially passwords. And the idea is people on this diagram, or entities on this diagram, that control the root keys can get in between parties on other ends of this chart that might think they're communicating with each other. But of course, if you can control someone's password, just as someone might hack your email, have your password send messages to your friends that your friends will think are coming from you, faulty messages could conceivably be sent through the manipulation of this public-private network. It's using private keys to communicate in an encrypted manner across this public network. Is that a fair explanation of what we're talking about with the Federal Bridge, David?
Yeah, I think so, Jason. I think you've just joined the ranks of the geniuses that you were isolating away from yourself. Yes, it's very tough, this. And why don't I just run back to Elizabethan times, Queen Elizabeth I, and give you an example of an extraordinary man-in-the-middle attack by the spy master for Elizabeth I, whose name was Sir Francis Walsingham. So Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, they were half sisters. And there was a threat that Sir Francis Walsingham managed to talk up into actionable intelligence, I think the phrase is, where he was concerned that Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic, would, with her allies, I think, in France and Spain, ultimately succeed in visiting hideous pogroms and massacres on the Protestants in England, So he wanted to neutralize this woman. Now, she'd been incarcerated, and I think for about 18 years, and she was in the habit, or she'd been persuaded, that she could communicate safely by smuggling a barrel of wine or beer or whatever it was, with a note secreted in the cork or the bung in the barrel. And she was writing, or through presumably one of her aides in her jail, or I think she was in a fairly upmarket palace, so it wasn't too uncomfortable. But someone was helping her encrypt her messages that were in support of her allies. And then Sir Francis Walsingham arranged to add a postscript to one of the messages in code, which indicated that she was all ready and willing to have her half-sister assassinated. And then, of course, that message was intercepted. So she wrote it or dictated it in good faith. The person who was encrypting her messages added the postscript, or maybe it was added after the barrel of wine or beer had been smuggled out of the palace or the castle. And then it was intercepted, and lo and behold, they decrypt the message. And there's enough evidence to put Mary, Queen of Scots, in front of a court or a tribunal, where she was convicted of attempting or wishing to having or conspiring to have her half-sister assassinated, and she was duly executed. And that's a man in the middle attack. Mary, Queen of Scots is writing or dictating in good faith, but by the time the message gets to the outside world, it looks like she's plotting to have someone killed, and that allows the parties on the outside, or operating the man in the middle attack, to arrange to have her executed. And of course, that's exactly what's happening on the Imperial Bridge, or the Federal Bridge, or the Imperial Brain back in the 1840s or 50s, when the British Empire was at its peak. And I believe there's a two-tier communication system that has grown up over the years. And now I'm quite sure there are other nations that have attempted to do this, but I believe there is only one nation that has perfected it, and that's English/British/Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland, etc., with the English language. We, and if I may dare to say so, I'm proud of my British ancestry. I'm proud of my Canadian citizenship. I'm proud of what Churchill would call, and I don't believe it was jingoistic, the English-speaking peoples have done and could do and are potentially capable of doing. What I'm less proud of is that within that framework that has brought some great benefits to the world in terms of justice and economic liberty and the great principles of what does King Ethelred the Unready, I think he was a Saxon king of the 9th or 10th century, he said, accuse no innocent and shelter no guilty. We are so far away from that state of affairs, Jason, that I believe it's morally incumbent upon you and myself and people of goodwill to restore that mantra to a pinnacle position. Accuse no innocent, shelter no guilty. Over to you.
I agree with you, David. It's become a huge problem, particularly with the proliferation of information through social media. Someone hears something about someone perhaps who they don't like, and without vetting the information, they're very quick to share it, and people can get convicted in the court of public opinion. So that's a very interesting story you were telling us about the man in the middle attack. And if I understood it correctly, in that scenario, Sir Francis Walsingham? Yeah, he was the man in the middle. He is the intermediary who is affecting the message in an unexpected way so that the person sending it thinks a good message has been sent, the person receiving it thinks a good message has been received, but only that man in the middle is aware that something has been changed about it that has strategic value in terms of knocking out the sender.
Absolutely, and you see that war game exercise, well, if I go back to the exercise Amalgam Virgo on the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001, that was an exercise where men in the middle, and unfortunately there's a lot of women in the middle of this, were checking out whether or not the United States, there's a number of opportunities for different arms of the military in the United States to have intervened in this, but what they knew, they had to TF, you probably know the meaning of that word, or that phrase, you had to TF the United States Air Force, right? Now, these are proud and capable men. I'm sure there are women Air Force pilots who are just as capable as the men folk. But if I dare say it, pilots are a rather unusual breed, right? They wear uniforms. I think they're attractive to the opposite sex very often. They travel the world. There's a certain amount of freedom and responsibilities that, particularly for young men and I guess young women, put them in potentially in harm's way. And of course, one of the arrangements when the hormones are raging, you get a pilot flying into Thailand or Kuala Lumpur or whatever. They check into a 4-star or 5-star hotel. They go out for that night. They're in the company of beautiful people, if I dare say it. They take some alcohol, they take some drugs, and they wake up in a bed with an underage child. Okay, now, does British intelligence use that exclusively? Absolutely not. Every major power with intelligence agents at its disposal is always looking for that, what they call the honey trap, right? And there are certain kinds of honey traps that I believe Kristine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, put together that are honey traps that maybe if people thought it through, they would realize just how dangerous this is. And if I may, I'd like to go to the honey trap that you can set up apropos of some of the conversations taking place between Field McConnell and his sister back in the 1980s, where Field tells me, or told me, that his sister had called him and said, how could she protect an aircraft carrying prisoners from a prisoner mutiny? Now, just to set things in context, Kristine Marcy had a career where she was joined as an intern in the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1968-69. Her first 3 bosses were Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Frank Carlucci. And if you fast forward from 1968 or 9 to 9/11, those 3 people had an absolutely pivotal role to play on 9/11 and the failure of the United States Air Force to basically detect and thwart what should have been very easy to stop, which is a bunch of lowlifes flying around in Boeing passenger jets where the transponders had been switched off, but they were eminently interceptable to be spot fixed and, if necessary, shot down. But that didn't happen.
Wait, David,
she then goes, go ahead.
Let's define for everyone the spot fixing term, because again, there are some of these terms that fly by, and I want to make sure everyone understands them.
Okay, spot fixing in betting, sports betting, might be that you bet the particular second or particular minute before which a ball at soccer is booted into the sidelines. So it doesn't change the overall result of the game. And of course, there is match fixing, which is different and requires much more planning because you've got to involve the entire team, either the attacking team or the defending team. Spot fixing is an event that doesn't really matter. So in a cricket game, it might be a no ball where the bowler gets his feet past the crease at the other end from the batting. Now, in case of dead pool betting, I better define that term. Dead pool betting is where you have a ring of people that are betting on death, which might be the body count in a mass casualty event or the time of death of a high-value target, such as JFK. So the event itself, it really doesn't matter. Obviously matters to the people in the fire department of New York, whether 343 firefighters died or 344 or 342. But it's of great interest to the people placing bets on the body count, because if you get that right, you scoop the pot. Now, The incentive for the ConAir SWAT teams, let's say, ConAir meaning, which is the shorthand or the nickname of the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, set up by Kristine Marcy in 1985, but formally introduced to the world in 1994 when the Clinton administration was in power. It doesn't really matter to the ConAir SWAT team whether 342 or 343 firefighters are killed. But if you're deploying those SWAT teams to kill a specific number of firefighters, and you've got serious money on 343, you want them to deliver 343 firefighters.
So
Now,
to
how
be clear,
does
just to
sorry, go
clarify,
ahead.
I want to make sure. So the spot fixing refers specifically in terms of, let's say, American football, perhaps the Super Bowl, okay? Someone can bet, hey, the Bears are going to win the Super Bowl or the Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl. That's one type of bet. But irrespective of who wins, perhaps someone might bet that Walter Payton is going to run 33 yards during the game. Doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the outcome of the overall game, but it's a specific incident within the game that can be bet upon and measured to a finite degree.
Yes, precisely. So the word precision is very important here, or accuracy. So spread betting, interestingly enough, was invented, I believe, by JFK's mathematics teacher at his grade school.
Whoa.
And he took it to Chicago and he started his own business. And spread betting is now a very big component where people bet on the accuracy of the result. So if A is a favorite and B is a lesser favorite, you might bet on A beating B by 3 goals or whatever like that. It's not an area I'm particularly familiar with, but spread betting is now a whole area of online gaming.
Yes.
That is immense and very, very powerful. Within that framework, of course, the spot fixers can move in and say, at Wimbledon that, one of the favorites will do a double fault on the third set in the 5th game. And again, it may not necessarily affect the result of the game, but it could result in $1 million going into the tennis stars' pockets, in a Swiss bank account. Got to be laundered.
Now, that's why I wanted to focus it. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's why I wanted to focus on that, because I want people to really have that clear in their minds. Because when we talk about death pool betting, I think the tendency is for many people to immediately think that you're proposing that the purpose of the 9/11 attacks was to do this betting. And of course, that's not the case, and that's not what you're saying. You're just saying that the possibility exists that there is a group of elite gamblers who have been operating in London for decades, centuries. You've pointed out White's Gambling Club. You've spoken to us about how Victor Rothschild was in addition to being involved with the Rothschild's bank, he was also, and he's an explosives expert and a chemistry expert and all this. He's also the head of the gambling authority there in the UK at the time that he was alive, correct?
He was the chairman of the Royal Commission on Gambling. He also is considered by many to have been the 5th man in the Cambridge spy ring. He has a variety of other extraordinary things in his past. He would lend his apartment in London, apparently in the run-up to World War II and the Cold War, to Anthony Blunt, the keeper of the Queen's pictures, and Guy Burgess. And these were homosexual pedophiles. And apparently they would have orgies that involved the strangling of an adolescent boy, while a man called Soxon Rothschild, S-O-X-O-N Rothschild, sodomized the strangler. Now, I'm sorry if that upsets people, but we should also remember that the use of pedophile entrapment is very widespread by the intelligence agencies. And we have, the United Kingdom had Jimmy Savile for decades, with the aura of the BBC around him, catching celebrities and presumably entrapping and ultimately blackmailing them. And of course, you have Jeffrey Epstein, who is the most disgusting human being, who should have been on death row, I believe, because he was flying Bill Clinton, Phi Beta Kappa incidentally, and Hillary Clinton to that island, I think it's called Little St. John's Island,
St. James,
to be serviced by Little St. James Island, was it?
I believe, yes.
Anyway, to that island, where they would be serviced by, I don't know, underage boys or underage girls. But there's some very sinister things in there. For example, there is an image of one of the bathrooms or washrooms or bathrooms in one of the chalets with a dentist chair in it. Now, the mind crawls, actually, the brain crawls at the thought of what might happen to the individual sitting in that chair, whether they were a young boy or a young girl, and someone was basically drilling through their teeth. But there's some seriously, seriously sick people in the jail system of the United Kingdom and the United States. You have private jail system. You have a system which Kristine Marcy and Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick put together in the 90s, where there was probably 1 million prisoners being moved around through ConAir. And obviously some of them will be pedophiles, and some of them will be psychopaths, and some of them will be killers. Now, if you're tracking using Jerome Lemelson's prisoner tracking system, which is one of the things schematically identified on the storyboard, then you would be able to quite possibly put together a cocktail of psychotropic drugs, for example, lysergic acid amide, invented by Eli Lilly and patented in 1956. And if you read through the patent application, it has this extraordinary and, for me, chilling phrase that this formulation, and there's dozens of others, may be related to LSD, for all I know. I'm not a chemist, but incidentally, Victor Rothschild was, so he would have understood the exact changes that such formulations might induce. But the argument in the patent was that these formulations are useful for psychotherapy research because it elicits characteristic patterns of rage and hallucinations. So you just pop into one of Kristine Marcy's prisons. You can say to some of these guys, well, we're going to give you 24 or 48 hours furlough, and you can go and torture a little girl to death in Boulder, Colorado over Christmas instead of going home to your family for Christmas. And then we'll have you back in jail, maybe in Canada, right, after Christmas, and we won't reveal to your fellow prisoners what you've been doing to children on Christmas Day, because, as you can imagine, Jason, the other prisoners, many of them being heterosexual and whatever their faults are in terms of jail worthiness, maybe they love their children, and they don't take kindly to these characters doing hideous things. That little girl was sodomized, she was tasered, her skull was fractured almost completely around, and she was garroted. And the end of the ransom note, it says, "Victory!" exclamation mark. And I'm saying, what the hell kind of victory is that, right? And then SBTC, that you and I have discussed, might suggest that the Sigma Beta Tau Greek life fraternity, a colony in Boulder, University of Colorado, may have actually had a rather bizarre initiation ceremony, where these people who got through the initiation ceremony then reached the highest level of the Greek life societies, where you have an intellectual elite and international bankers that perhaps are moving into a transnational government where the sovereign state is withered away because the established leaders have no defense against a man-in-the-middle attack. Over to you.
I'm glad you went through all that, David, because as time goes on and you and I are getting to know each other better, and I'm studying the information that you share more, I've recognized that you haven't wavered from what you've been saying for the year that I've known you, but it's becoming more clear to me. And I really appreciate, some people may feel we're being somewhat repetitious in saying this stuff again and again, but it's dense, it's difficult to follow, and it's hard to believe. But as you've just pointed out, we know Jimmy Savile was a pedophile, a necrophile, and close to the royal family, and embedded in the BBC, and famous throughout the United Kingdom. So it's interesting to compare that with the actions of Jeffrey Epstein. And as we were looking at that island it really is a very luxurious thing. I mean, and I don't think most people own their own island. We saw there's a tennis court there. There's obviously very lavish facilities. It's out in the middle of the ocean. It looks like it would be a sort of a holiday paradise. And then there's this bizarre temple with a dome on it. And we've heard all the stories of Lolita Express jet. And so people sometimes, I've been saying this quite a lot this week. There's that quote from J. Edgar Hoover where he says that, something to the effect of, the individual is at a disadvantage when faced with a conspiracy so vast, it's just almost unbelievable that such a thing could exist. And I believe that's one of the key pillars of this type of centuries-old conspiracy, where we have these extremely wealthy, in some cases royalty, in some cases banking families, whatever it might be. They have this well-established pattern of gambling on events where they don't care, if it's something happening in a war, something happening in a mass casualty event. They basically consider anyone and everyone who dies in that event to be a worthless piece of collateral damage. And isn't there some sick, twisted, exciting thrill in betting on the misfortune of others? Because it's so unimportant to us, it might as well be a motivation for wagering in the same way that running a football down a field might be for a casual bettor. And you've outlined all the players and shown what they've done, their means, their opportunity, the motives in some cases. It's astounding, David.
Well, thank you very much. And just to give you a little flavor of Kristine Marcy, and we haven't discussed it at length, but the other day, and I was chatting with my son, I was trying to search for the appropriate term, and I think I knew it, what replaced video games, and apparently the term is online gaming, which gives great amusement to hundreds of thousands of people, but particularly young people. I've got some friends who have nephews and so on, and they spend hours and hours on this online gaming stuff, knocking over knights and building castles and armies, and they get certain set of weapons. And I was thinking, that what we're talking about here, one way of communicating it to the public, and particularly getting the young into this loop of deductive computing, would be to create a game where you and I are actually improving a game, like beta testing a game that could later become an online game with enormous implications, where people actually learn how to do deductive computing. And I'm thinking, and I still don't know whether Kristine Marcy is the most evil person in the world, or the one that was seen as an appropriate vehicle to transmit evil. That is to say, we're all young once. Field tells me that she did a gig in Chicago as a babysitter, I think probably around the 1966 period. Now, in 1966 or 68, you have a couple of psychopaths in Chicago that would go on to lead the Weather Underground organization.
Right.
One is Bernardine Dawn, and the other is Bill Ayers, and they should have been on death row years ago. They're home free as far as the elite left-wing community is concerned, because they think, the left wing, that these people have taken on the great Satan. Now, let's understand this Bernardine Dawn a little bit. She lectured at Northwestern University in various faculty roles, I think.
I believe
one
she's
of
an
her
adjunct
seminars. Go ahead.
I believe she's a faculty adjunct there still.
Right, whatever that means. Now, one of her seminars is Torture Paradigms and Practice. There's a picture that I think has been removed from the internet, and I can't find it, of a black guy with a fish hook through his lower lip, where it is alleged she used to pull the guy around on a fishing line, right? Obviously, he moved to reduce the pain in his lower lip. She's alleged to have been the woman who invented the three-finger fork salute that represented the Charlie Manson gang's decision to put a fork through the pregnant belly of Sharon Tate. I mean, These are about as sick as you can get, but they are idolized by the hardcore left because any crime they can commit that has as its objective the overthrow. Now, I believe you put in, was it the last show, you found a reference in Wikipedia called radical lesbians. In French, they call them les lesbiennes radicales.
Yes.
Now, this is a group of women that I think were formed in Quebec and France in the early 1980s. And their goal, as described in the Wikipedia and elsewhere, is the overthrow of the much hated heteropatriarchal society. And I don't know whether you're a heteropatriarch, Jason. I wish you well if you are, right?
I don't know about the patriarch
whether
part.
What?
I don't know about the patriarch part.
Well, I think many white men, if they were told they were members of a heteropatriarchal society, would they demur because they'd look back on their past where women were telling them what to do and they did exactly what they were told. I'm certainly on that side of the camp. I had a very forceful and powerful mother and very able wives. One passed away, the other one is still around. She's an ex. But for myself, to be described as heteropatriarchal, it seems a little anomalous, right? But these women are truly dangerous because they've weaponized their sexual orientation. And so when Kristine Marcy in 1994, presumably with Hillary Clinton, who with Huma Abedin is rumored to be a lesbian, they introduced the Department of Justice Pride program. I think you have a mens rea, or potentially a mens rea, for these kind of attacks over the Imperial Bridge. And that's why, if you can just zoom in on the schematic that you put together for today's show. I see we've only got 20 minutes, but I'd just like to illustrate
Well, actually,
why
David,
it's interesting to have Kristine Marcy on the left and Field McConnell on the right.
Just quickly, David, we've got
Sorry.
8 minutes because we need a few minutes
Okay.
to reset for Patreon. But
Okay,
please carry
if
on.
you go to the side of Kristine Marcy about thigh height, you'll see three organizations that I believe she has corrupted over the years. The state of Illinois. Now, state of Illinois is probably the most corrupt state in the union, but I'm particularly interested by a guy by the name of George Ryan, who was the governor of Illinois, and he went down to jail for racketeering. But he spent 20 years in statewide office as lieutenant governor under Governor James R. Thompson from 1983 to 1991. He was Secretary of State from 1991 to 1999, and he was governor from 1999 to 2003. And he's been in jail. 4 out of the last 7 governors of Illinois have been in jail for various crimes. His was racketeering. So it strikes me as very odd that during the period that Michelle Obama serves as an intern, and then Barack Obama serves as an intern at Sidley Austin, it is probable they were being groomed by Bernardine Dawn, the woman who lectures on torture paradigms and practice. My theory is that both Bernardine Dawn, Barack Hussein Obama, and Michelle Obama are practiced pedophile entrapment experts. And that the control these two developed, and I believe Michelle Obama is Alpha Kappa Alpha. Lord knows what Barack Hussein Obama belongs to. But effectively, that's a very powerful method of entrapping some of the most powerful people in Chicago, let's say at Hull House, which I think Field McConnell and I succeeded in getting shut down. But if you look at Hull House, dating back to 1889, when Ellen Starr and Jane Addams, a couple of lesbians, came back from a stay at Toynbee Hall during the period of the Whitechapel murders, where women were eviscerated by a man, allegedly, Jack the Ripper. I think, and I have a theory that it was Jane the Ripper, but that's by the by. They come back and create this university hostel movement in Chicago with Hull House, where there's wonderful access for people so minded to young children. And I think it became a pedophile brothel, an entrapment speciality, perfected and designed and manipulated by the Obamas on their way into the White House. So that's over on the left, and over on the right you have the picture of Field McConnell. The backdrop to the schematic is Pan Am 103, but if you look at what's to the left of, my left as I look at the schematic of Field McConnell, a brilliant fighter pilot with 23,000 hours of flying experience. You've got Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and the Boeing Company. And with those four defense contractors, plus the evil parties on the left, including State of Illinois, Department of Justice, and Veterans Affairs, Kristine Marcy could launch a man-in-the-middle attack on her brother's pilot friends, or vice versa. Now, from the mens rea or the guilty mind point of view, I would say the evil resides in the lesbian radicals that have surrounded Kristine Marcy in her career. She did live with, even though she'd normally got a husband, Leonora Guaria. As I understand it, these two women used to go on sex tours on Romanian orphanages. Whoa. And pick up little girls. Now, you can ask Field about that, but that's what he told me, so I don't want to encroach on people's sensibilities, but I think Kristine Marcy potentially in any online gaming would make a wonderful figure of evil. And Field, I think, has great good intentions, but I don't think he can recognize a man-in-the-middle attack if it came from his sister and reared up from behind him. Over to you.
It's an amazing theory that you've laid out for us here, David. And of course, this is, you called me yesterday sort of with an epiphany, wanting to do this show specifically about this. The man-in-the-middle attack is a very effective method. And of course, we're going to be going in depth on these new findings and your new theories related to this in just less than 15 minutes at 4 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Pacific, only on Patreon. Sponsors of patreon.com/crowdsource the truth can watch that exclusive stream. People can also sponsor David by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. And I can see, David, that you've added one sponsor during our broadcast here, so that's very good. Excellent. Definitely want to thank the generous Patreon sponsors. It just is not possible for us to sustain this type of broadcasting and keep these types of shows coming without the support of the community at large. So I definitely want to thank all of our sponsors and encourage people who are viewing on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth to go to David's page, Reverse CSI Storyboards, and that's also on patreon.com. I hope that people will become sponsors of David. David, what we're going to do right now, we'll break from this free preview here on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook and VK.com, Gab.ai, DLive, all of the various platforms that we go out on. And I want to thank you for sharing that extensive information. Certainly if I were watching free of charge, I would consider that a valuable show loaded with content. But for people that are really interested in digging into this, and for people that want to support David's efforts, and people that want to support Crowdsource the Truth, we'll see you in just 11 minutes from now, only on Patreon. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're going to continue this incredible deep dive at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. David, I'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be with you.
And thanks everyone for watching.